Critics of nuclear war strategy often suggest that a nuclear war between two nations would result in mutual annihilation. From this point of view, the significance of nuclear weapons is to deter war, because any nuclear war would escalate out of mutual distrust and fear, resulting in mutually assured destruction. This threat of national, if not global, destruction has been a strong motivation for anti-nuclear weapons activism. Critics from the peace movement and within the military establishment have questioned the usefulness of such weapons in the current military climate. According to an advisory opinion issued by the International Court of Justice in 1996, the use of, or threat of use of, such weapons would generally be contrary to the now decommissioned United States Peacekeeper missile was an ICBM developed to replace the Minuteman missile in the late 1980s. Each missile, like the heavier lift Russian SS-18 Satan, could contain up to 10 nuclear warheads, shown in red, each of which could be aimed at a different target. A factor in their development of MIRVs was to make complete missile defense difficult for an enemy country. Rules of international law applicable in armed conflict, but the court did not reach an opinion as to whether or not the threat or use would be lawful in specific extreme circumstances, such as if the survival of the state were at stake. Ballistic missile submarines have been of great strategic importance for the United States, Russia, and of the nuclear powers since they entered service in the Cold War. They can hide from reconnaissance satellites and fire their nuclear weapons with virtual impunity. Another deterrence position is that nuclear proliferation can be desirable. In this case, it is argued that, unlike conventional weapons, nuclear weapons deter all-out war between states, and they succeeded in doing this during the Cold War between the U.S. and the Soviet Union. 31. In the late 1950s and early 1960s, General Pierre-Marie Gallois of France, an advisor to Charles de Gaulle, argued in books like The Balance of Terror, Strategy for the Nuclear Age, 1961, that mere possession of a nuclear arsenal was enough to ensure deterrence, and thus concluded that the spread of nuclear weapons could increase international stability. Some prominent neorealist scholars, such as Kenneth Waltz and John Miyashima, have argued, along the lines of Gallois, that some forms of nuclear proliferation would decrease the likelihood of total war, especially in troubled regions of the world where there exists a single nuclear weapons state. Aside from the public opinion that opposes proliferation in any form, there are two schools of doubt in the matter: those, like Miyashima, who favored selective proliferation, 32, and Waltz, who was somewhat more non-interventionist. 33, 34, interest in proliferation and the stability-instability paradox that it generates continues to this day, with ongoing debate about indigenous Japanese and South Korea nuclear deterrent against North Korea. 35, the threat of potentially suicidal terrorists. Possessing nuclear weapons, a form of nuclear terrorism, complicates the decision process. The prospect of mutually assured destruction might not deter an enemy who expects to die in the confrontation. Further, if initial act is from a stateless terrorist instead of a sovereign nation, there might not be a nation or specific target to retaliate against. It has been argued, especially after the 11th of September, 2001 attacks, that this complication calls for a new nuclear strategy, one that is distinct from that which gave relative stability during the Cold War. 36. Since 1996, the United States has had a policy of following the targeting of its nuclear weapons at terrorists armed with weapons of mass destruction. 37. Robert Galaxy argues that although traditional deterrence is not an effective approach toward terrorist groups bent on causing a nuclear catastrophe, Galaxy believes that the United States should instead consider a policy of expanded deterrence, which focuses not solely on would-be nuclear terrorists but on those states that may deliberately transfer or inadvertently leak nuclear weapons and materials to them. By threatening retaliation against those states, the United States may be able to deter that which it cannot physically prevent. 38. Graham Allison makes a similar case, arguing that the key to expanded deterrence is coming up with ways of tracing nuclear material to the country that forged the fissile material. After a nuclear bomb detonates, nuclear forensics cops would collect debris samples and send them to a laboratory for radiological analysis. By identifying unique attributes of the fissile material, including its impurities and contaminants, one could. A Minuteman III ICBM test launch from Vandenberg Air Force Base, United States. MIRV land-based EDICMs are considered destabilizing because they tend to put a pre-human striking first. Trace the path back to its origin. 39. The process is analogous to identifying a criminal by fingerprints. The goal would be twofold. First, to deter leaders of nuclear states from selling weapons to terrorists by holding them accountable for any use of their weapons. Second, to give leaders every incentive to tightly secure the nuclear weapons and materials. 39. According to the Pentagon's June 2019 Doctrine for Joint Nuclear Operations of the Joint Chiefs of Staff's website publication, integration of nuclear weapons employment with conventional and special operations forces is essential to the success of any mission or operation. 41. Governance, control, and law. The International Atomic Energy Agency was created in 1957 to encourage peaceful development of nuclear technology while providing international safeguards against nuclear proliferation. Because they are weapons of mass destruction, the proliferation and possible use of nuclear weapons are important issues in international relations and diplomacy. In most countries, the use of nuclear force can only be authorized by the head of government or head of state. C. Despite controls and regulations governing nuclear weapons, there is an inherent danger of accidents, mistakes, false alarms, blackmail, theft, and sabotage. 42. In the late 1940s, lack of mutual trust prevented the United States and the Soviet Union from making progress on arms control agreements. The Russell-Einstein Manifesto was issued in London on the 9th of July 1955 by Bertrand Russell in the midst of the Cold War. It highlighted the dangers posed by nuclear weapons and called for world leaders to seek peaceful resolutions to international conflict. The signatories included 11 preeminent intellectuals and scientists, including Albert Einstein, who signed it just days before his death on the 18th of April, 1955. A few days after the release, philanthropist Cyrus S. Eaton offered to sponsor a conference called for in the manifesto in Pugwash, Nova Scotia, Eaton's birthplace. This conference was to be the first of the Pugwash Conferences on Science and World Affairs, held in July 1957. By the 1960s, steps were taken to limit both the proliferation of nuclear weapons to other countries and the environmental effects of nuclear testing. The Partial Nuclear Test Ban Treaty, 1963, restricted all nuclear testing to underground nuclear testing, to prevent contamination from nuclear fallout, whereas the Treaty on Non-Proliferation of Nuclear Weapons, 1968, attempted to place restrictions on the types of activity signatories could participate in, with the goal of allowing the transference of non-military nuclear technology to member countries without fear of proliferation. In 1957, the International Atomic Energy Agency, IAEA, was established under the mandate of the United Nations to encourage development of peaceful applications of nuclear technology, provide international safeguards against its misuse, and facilitate the application of safety measures in its use. In 1996, many nations signed the Comprehensive Nuclear Test Ban Treaty, 43, which prohibits all testing of nuclear weapons. A testing ban imposes a significant hindrance to nuclear arms development by any complying country. 44. The treaty requires the ratification by 44 specific states before it can go into force. As of 2012, the ratification of 8 of these states is still required. 43. UN vote on adoption of the Treaty on Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons on the 7th of July, 2017. Yes, no, did not vote. Additional treaties and agreements have governed nuclear weapon stockpiles between the countries with the two largest stockpiles, the United States and the Soviet Union, and later between the United States and Russia. These include treaties such as SALT II, never ratified, START I, expired, INF, START II, never in effect, SALT, and New START, as well as non-binding agreements such as SALT I and the Presidential Nuclear Initiatives, 45, of 1991. Even when they did not enter into force, these agreements help limit and later reduce the numbers and types of nuclear weapons between the United States and the Soviet Union /Russia. Nuclear weapons have also been opposed by agreements between countries. Many nations have been declared nuclear weapon-free zones, areas where nuclear weapons production and deployment are prohibited, through the use of treaties. The Treaty of Tlatelolco, 1967, prohibited any production or deployment of nuclear weapons in Latin America and the Caribbean, and the Treaty of Pelindaba, 1964, prohibits nuclear weapons in many African countries. As recently as 2006, a Central Asian nuclear weapon-free zone was established among the former Soviet republics of Central Asia, prohibiting nuclear weapons. Large stockpile with global range, dark blue. Smaller stockpile with global range, medium blue. Small stockpile with regional range, light blue. In 1996, the International Court of Justice, the highest court of the United Nations, issued an advisory opinion concerned with the legality of the threat or use of nuclear weapons. The court ruled that the use or threat of use of nuclear weapons would violate various articles of international law, including the Geneva Conventions, the Hague Conventions, the UN Charter, and the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Given the unique destructive characteristics of nuclear weapons, the International Committee of the Red Cross calls on states to ensure that these weapons are never used, irrespective of whether they consider them lawful or not. 46. Additionally, there have been other, specific actions meant to discourage countries from developing nuclear arms. In the wake of the tests by India and Pakistan in 1998, economic sanctions were, temporarily, levied against both countries, though neither were signatories with the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. One of the stated casus belli for the initiation of the 2003 Iraq War was an accusation by the United States that Iraq was actively pursuing nuclear arms, though this was soon discovered not to be the case as the program had been discontinued. In 1981, Israel had bombed a nuclear reactor being constructed in Osirak, Iraq, in what it called an attempt to halt Iraq's previous nuclear arms ambitions. In 2007, Israel bombed another reactor being constructed in Syria. In 2013, Mark Diesendorf said that governments of France, India, North Korea, Pakistan, UK, and South Africa have used nuclear power or research reactors to assist nuclear weapons development or to contribute to their supplies of nuclear explosives from military reactors. 47. In 2017, 122 countries mainly in the Global South voted in favor of adopting the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, which eventually entered into force in 2021. 48. The Doomsday Clock measures the likelihood of a human-made global catastrophe and is published annually by the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists. The 2 years with the highest likelihood had previously been in 1953, when the clock was set to 2 minutes until midnight after the US and the Soviet Union began testing hydrogen bombs, and 2018, following the failure of world leaders to address tensions relating to nuclear weapons and climate change issues. 49. In 2023, following the escalation of nuclear threats during the Russian invasion of Ukraine, the doomsday clock was set to 90 seconds. The highest likelihood of global catastrophe